And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues. Now, there are some stories in the Bible that roll round every year. Angels and shepherds, wise men, donkeys into Jerusalem, and one that has long held a fascination for me. The walk to Emmaus. Cleopas and the other disciple heading off post-crucifixion. Probably fair to say that they are not main characters in the story of the disciples. Maybe describe them as part of the chorus, extras even, standing on the periphery. But in that moment, when Jesus had been crucified, they were perhaps in an understandable state of confusion and lack of understanding. They abandoned the group. They walked away from the community. They wanted to head home. And although he may well have had more important things to do that day of the resurrection, Jesus came to them. In their confusion, in their hurt, in their ignorance, he came to them. He walked with them. He listened to their need. And most importantly, he answered it. It was only a 7-mile walk, maybe 3 hours in that climate? And yet it was a walk that changed everything, if I may steal from the title of my guest for this week's Life Issues. He is Dr. John Andrews. drjohnandrews.co.uk is his website. He's a leader, a teacher, an author, and a regular contributor to Life Issues, and joins me to talk about the experience of his two disciples as he has covered it in his book, Emmaus, the walk that changed everything. So I've described them as part of the chorus, John, even maybe extras. Who were they? And why were they heading away from Jerusalem?
It's a great question. When we read the Gospels, of course, we do have this understanding that there's a much wider group around the 12, the core, that sometimes we refer to. And that group is quite large. In fact, at one point in the Gospel of Luke, we have as many as 70 or 72 being sent out. Luke's gospel is very, very helpful in that he also shows us a lot of women around that wider group. You can track that from Luke chapter 8 onwards. So the idea that you have two disciples, one of whom is named for the very first time in the context of the Gospels, and the other is unnamed, is this sense that perhaps they were part of this wider group. They were not that 12, but walking with Jesus and learning with Jesus and growing with Jesus, and that wider discipleship group working with him. In terms of the actual text, we don't know a lot about them. In fact, the way Dr. Luke talks about them, he seems to assume that his listeners will know who they are. Mm-hmm. But he simply names one, the man, Cleopas. And then we have the other person who remains nameless. But of course, the interesting thing, and it's a little reflection I try to make in the book, is that generally speaking, we make the assumption that both of these disciples were men. But there is absolutely nothing in the text itself to suggest they were both men. In fact, you could make such a strong assumption also about the fact that one was a man and possibly one was a woman, maybe even his wife, because they both return to Emmaus. They both go to the same house. And when we get to the end of the story, they both invite Jesus in. So there is this real understanding that perhaps this is a couple who are walking away. And in the context of male-female, in the Gospel of Luke, and even in the wider narrative of the Garden of Eden, this is a beautiful potential nuance in the story that makes it even more dynamic and rich in the context of a wider biblical understanding.
And you make a point, and it's not only in the book, but it's also on the back of the book, which is where I first read it. And you make a point that by the end of their walk, nothing will ever be the same again, hence the walk that changed everything. Emmaus was their home, but not their destiny. It's a hard thing to recognize that home may not be destiny. You talk about it for yourself and the attraction and the safety and the security of home. To actually see that as, well, not being where God wants us to be is not always an easy thing to embrace, is it?
It's true. It's true. And one of the things I try to get people to think about in the context of the book, which I do think is there is that although Emmaus is a literal place, so it is aware. It's a place they are going and a place where they live. Emmaus, I think, also represents what? It represents a belief system. It represents, in some ways, the places we go in our default belief system when we hit moments of pressure, anxiety, disappointment, worry. I think that's what's happening here. So, although in one respect, there's nothing wrong with going home. I love going home. I'm literally recording this with you from my home. So I love going home. So it's important we're not hearing the wrong thing here. But in this case, home is not just a place. Home is a default belief system. Home is something that has filled their heart. It's gripped their heart. And actually, Emmaus is the only place where the disappointment, the pain, the anxiety is going to make sense. So there was nothing wrong with Emmaus, and there's nothing wrong with going home, except that Jesus didn't want them to return to Emmaus. He wanted them to stay in Jerusalem. And therefore, the act of going home is not just a geographic act. It's not just a journey. It is an actual belief journey that's happening here within them, and something that I believe Jesus then wants to correct. And I think that's why you see Jesus spending so long on the road with them, unpacking the scriptures to them, because this is not simply about where they are going. This is about what they are believing. This is not just about a place or a home. This is about destiny and belief system.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a beautiful sort of running motif through the whole of the story.
And of course, they're not the only ones that went for that. I'm going to go to that which is familiar to me to find understandable, I suppose, to find comfort and safety. They'd just seen Jesus crucified. They'd just seen this horrendous form of death to someone that they had followed, they'd hoped in, they'd put their aspirations on, and confronted with that. I mean, it's a bit like Peter turning to the others and going, I'm going fishing. You know, it's that sort of, let me find something that is familiar to deal with the trauma of this. But what they actually needed was the journey with Jesus to deal with the trauma of it.
Yeah, it's completely understandable. I think when we see Emmaus not just as their literal physical home, but a place of escape, a place of comfort, a place of security and safety, a place that will help them to try and make sense of the brutality that they've just witnessed over the previous weekend. Their language is clear on the road when they meet the stranger that we know as Jesus. You know, we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. So the journey that they're making on Emmaus is one absolutely now saturated with hopelessness. And in that hopelessness, often we default to the places of comfort, to the places that make sense to us, even if they're not the places that actually the Lord wants us to be in and the places the Lord wants us to reside. And I think that's one of the great tensions in our journey as followers of Jesus. There are moments when we are in pain and discomfort and distress, then we move to, or we reach for, or we sit in ideas or belief system that brings us comfort, but isn't necessarily bringing us life, isn't necessarily bringing us healing, and isn't necessarily turning us around. And I think what you've got in Emmaus is a place of comfort, but not a place of life. It is a place of security emotionally, but it's not a place that's going to transform them spiritually and in terms of their destiny and emotion. And Jesus understands that. I think if they get to Emmaus and they open that door and they go in that house, they will probably never leave that place again. And Jesus wants to turn them around, not just physically back to Jerusalem, but metaphorically to the purpose for which they've been called and destined through the resurrection life that he has secured for them.
And yet, in that moment, when they arrived in Emmaus and they walked past their front door and they turned to go in, he made to carry on without them. He didn't linger. He didn't go, oh, hey, any chance of a coffee? Yeah, come on, put the kettle on. We'll have a chat some more. He didn't do that. It was very much up to them whether they invited him into that place.
It's a real powerful moment. In fact, in the story, we really have two dynamic, awkward moments. You've got the holding of the eyes moment. They were kept from recognizing him back in verse 16. And that's awkward enough, that sense of, my goodness, in a chapter full of openings, their eyes are held. And that reflection that, why would Jesus hold their eyes when he's actually drawing alongside them? This is the second awkward moment. This is a really, really dynamic moment where he's had this long conversation. We're not exactly sure at what point he joined the road, but this is an involved and dynamic conversation, beginning with Moses and the prophets. He explained to them everything that was written about himself in the scriptures. I mean, what a sermon. Probably his greatest New Testament sermon, reserved for his smallest audience. An amazing, amazing sermon. And yet, at the end of that journey, he acts as if, you could almost use the language, he pretends as if he's going farther. And I think if the first awkward moment where their eyes are held is Jesus wants to know what they know, then the second awkward moment where he's acting as if he's going further, I think Jesus is wanting to know what they will do. And I think we know from the story that once they get inside and Jesus appears to them, it disappears. They say, did not our hearts burn inside us when he was opening the scripture? So we now know that as they were walking along, something was burning inside them that they couldn't explain intellectually, but they were resonating with spiritually. And so when Jesus acts as if he's going to go further, is Jesus then probing for that? Is Jesus probing to see, what will you now do? Your hearts are burning, even though your brains have still got to catch up with this idea. Your hearts are burning. What are you going to do with that burning heart? What are you going to do with what's going on inside you, even though you cannot logically or intellectually explain it? And I think that's why he's moving on, because he wants to see what they will do and how they will respond. It's awkward. It's not comfortable. It's paradoxical. I think there's so much in the Christian life and even in the story that represents really difficult paradox and tension. But actually, these paradox and tension are all about getting us to a place where the Lord wants us to go. And I think that's what he wants. He wants to be invited, but he wants to know, do they want him in?
And there is a contextualization, isn't there, of what comes after, because, and then towards the end of your book, you start to focus, and today we're going to focus on that experience at the end of the journey itself, incredibly important. What was unpacked, incredibly important. The information we have about what was actually said, incredibly scanty. I mean, one day we'll discover, maybe, but not today. But that moment, it's almost like the journey itself was the build-up to that moment where they turned aside to the door, and them inviting him in. I don't know. Does it say something about them and their attitude, and maybe their attitude about themselves and their hunger? It was hospitable to do that as well. But was there more to it in terms of this burning within them?
Well, I really think there is. I think for a number of reasons, Paul. So one of the reasons we could work on this is we could say, well, this is just good Jewish hospitality. Two people would never allow a stranger to walk towards the evening, perhaps on their own, without offering them overnight or even food hospitality. So there's one level at which you could argue this away as a pure hospitality issue. But I think the strength of the text itself is pointing to something much more urgent. I think we're given some clues. Number one, we know after the event that their hearts are burning. So we know something's going on in them. Secondly, it is both of them inviting him in. It's a plural imperative. They're both saying, stay with us. And then it's the language of stay with us, which is absolutely powerful. So the NIV and the ESV put it as they urged him strongly in the translation of this phrase. I love how the Complete Jewish Bible puts it. They held him back. They constrained him. So the idea here is of really quite aggressive language towards Jesus. This is them if you were interpreting this physically, it would be me grabbing you literally and saying, come in. It's a constraining language. And then what adds the final thing to it is that in the language of Dr. Luke, it's an imperative. So in other words, it's the closest thing to a command you're going to get in terms of verbal restraint. So this is not just politeness, Paul. This is passion. This is not just them being good Jewish people offering good Jewish hospitality. This is the response of hearts that were once hopeless, and now something is igniting within them. They don't quite know what it is, but they know it's good, and they're responding to that. And that burning within them is the thing that is provoking the invitation. Stay with us, stay with us. This incredible sense of almost commanded, aggressive invitation. This is not politeness, this is passion. And I think the text itself is evidence of that idea.
And that hunger, that passion, of course, is the very thing which creates the opportunity for the truth of Jesus to be revealed. And if they hadn't had it, or if they hadn't acknowledged it or surrendered to it, then that opportunity could conceivably have been missed.
I absolutely believe so. There's a beautiful echo of this in both a backward story and a forward story. And there's an echo in the Garden of Eden that when the Lord walks in the cool of the day, the humans hide from him. Yes. They step away from his presence. They cover themselves up like horrifically with these awful fig leaf sort of aprons. And then they hide behind the bushes, and they're hearing the Lord walking, and they're hiding from him. And of course, it's God's question to them. It's the Lord's question to Adam specifically, where are you? That causes them to come from behind the bushes and actually stand in his presence and be confronted. And then if we go further into the New Testament, you've got Jesus standing outside the door of a Christian community in Laodicea and saying, behold, yes. I'm standing at the door and knocking. If anyone can hear me and will open up the door to me, I will come in and be with them and commune with them. So this idea of inviting the Lord in is not just unique to Emmaus. This is a constant narrative all through the scriptures. And there's a sense in which the Lord, because he is the Lord, all-powerful and able to do whatever he wants, could technically impose himself into our home. He could impose himself into our world. But actually, the way he works is he wants to draw something from us so that we want him. We want his presence. We want his word. We want him to come in. We're saying to him, like the two on the road, stay with us. Please come in and commune with us. And he wants us to want him. And I think that's what makes this magnificent moment in this story so dynamically powerful. Because technically and theoretically, had they not wanted him, he would have kept walking. Mm-hmm. And this story would never have been written. But because they wanted him, he then went in and communed with them. And I think it's one of the most beautiful lines in the story. Then he went in with them. And you get this beautiful sense of Jesus reclining at their dinner table, waiting for dinner to be made in order to reveal himself to them. But it all hinges on their invitation and their passion and their hunger.
And it is not insignificant, I think, that this wasn't it wasn't your Peters. It wasn't your Andrews. These were sort of part of the wider group. They weren't part of the inner circle. And yet Jesus still took the physical time, the literal time to walk with them and to be with them. And of course, then to, at the end of the meal, to actually perform the first post-resurrection communion service. Staggering thing.
It is totally staggering. I think if there's such a thing as a sort of a heaven flicks library when we get to heaven, this is one of the stories I do want to watch, and I want to see this unpacked frame by frame. And you're absolutely right. The the hidden in plain sight magnificence of this story is that these are just two ordinary disciples. In fact, one of them's not even named. And yet the Lord of heaven goes out of his way, walks 7 miles in the wrong direction. I'm getting emotional just thinking about it. He walks 7 miles in the wrong direction to return them, to save them, to give them a hope and a future. And this should speak to all of our hearts that the Lord was prepared to leave, as you said, Peter, Andrew, John, Thomas, all the others. He's now left them in Jerusalem, and he's gone after two on this road to nowhere. This road to this little village that's only mentioned once in the whole of the scriptures. But Jesus thought them important enough.
Yes.
Important enough to pursue them in order to save them, even though we know almost nothing about them. And I love that, Paul. I love the fact that there is a God in heaven who pursues us even when the planet we live in knows nothing about us or even cares nothing about us and is not interested in us. There is a God who draws near to us, walks with us, and he's even prepared if we invite him in to have dinner with us.
And in that moment, he breaks the bread. They see the reality. Their eyes are opened. And it is the moment where, well, I think this is a direct quote from your book. I might be slightly paraphrasing, but it's the moment where the information that they've received becomes revelation. Their eyes are opened. And we can know a lot about the Bible. We can know a lot about Jesus. We can know a lot about the crucifixion and his death and the resurrection. But there's a difference where information becomes revelation, isn't there?
Oh, completely. It's a massive idea. And I think in my experience, I've discovered that information, as good as it is, only informs us, whereas revelation transforms us. It's when we see it for ourselves that becomes, my granny would have used this phrase, when the penny drops. It's when you see it for yourself, and that becomes a living reality in you. And there is this gorgeous moment, and the magnificence of it mustn't be lost on is that it's not a coincidence that the revelation of Jesus as the risen Messiah happens in the context of in breaking bread. And the language is gorgeous. It says in verse 30 of the passage, Luke 24, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And what's incredible about that, Paul, is that is almost identical language to the Last Supper. So if you track that back to Luke 22, it says this: he took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them. Now, I suspect that these two may have been in that room. We tend to think only the 12 were there at the Last Supper, but Mark makes it clear there were others in the room. By implication, could it be that they had been in that room, and therefore when Jesus becomes the host of the meal and breaks the bread and opens this up, that somehow that familiar, gorgeous moment becomes the catalyst for revelation? But what we do know for certain, and again, this is important for us to understand, that there is a definite moment of revelation in that. It says, and their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. So this is not just them opening their eyes. The implication is their eyes are being opened, and they're seeing something that they've never seen before. In fact, in Luke 24, 3 things are open. He opens the scriptures, he opens their eyes, and later on in Luke 24, he opens the minds of the wider group of the disciples. And each time we see an opening in Luke 24, we have one in verse 31, 32, and 45. Every time something's opened, someone's doing the opening, and as a result of that opening, something supernatural or transformational takes place. And I think this is a powerful moment, that as they break bread, however we understand that, they have a revelatory experience. They see him. they recognize him. And it's that seeing Jesus that changes everything. Once you see him, you cannot unsee him. Once you hear him, you cannot unhear that. You've got to put that somewhere now. And our lives are about to be transformed because of that revelation.
And the embracing of that, of course, transforms their moment, but it also transforms what they do. Because as we know, their immediate response after they've gone, goodness me, how did we not know this? Did our hearts not burn within us, etc.? The moment they've done that, they go, we need to go and tell the lads. We need to go and tell the rest. We need to go and communicate it. And they race back to Jerusalem. Encountering the risen Jesus changes the perspective of where they should be. There's a message there, isn't there?
Oh, completely. Absolutely. I think if you look at it closely, it changes everything for them. It changes their direction of travel. They get up at once and go back to Jerusalem. And I would be fairly certain that the pace in which they returned was much quicker than the pace in which they went to Emmaus. Although I do suspect that the closer they got to Emmaus, I think their pace may have picked up because their energy levels may have done also. But I would suspect they got back to Jerusalem much, much faster. And of course, the other thing that changes is their confession. We have seen the Lord. And then we get this lovely phrase at the end of the story that they tell how all that he had said and how he was recognized in the breaking of the bread. In other words, what they do is, Paul, they not only talk about what they've seen, but they rehearse what they heard. And this is the dynamic combination. They've seen Jesus, but then clearly the implication is they rehearse the sermon, this amazing sermon from Moses and the prophets. They rehearse that sermon back to the disciples. And I think that sermon and other sermons that Jesus will give them in the 40 days between resurrection and ascension, I think that sermon forms the bedrock of a post-resurrection narrative for those Jewish believers in their understanding of what we call the Old Testament, but also in the proclamation of Jesus to the Jewish world and beyond, that Jesus is alive. And actually, this shouldn't be a surprise to us because Moses, the prophets, and the writings talk about it. So it's this gorgeous combination of revelation, our eyes have seen, but also conveying the teaching that Jesus gives them. And I think it's both of those things together that produce an incredible engine room of transformation in our lives. What we see, what we hear, what we have had in revelation, and what we know to be true. That becomes the engine room of our lives as we go forward.
It is interesting as well, I think, the way in which that they're engaged with when they get back to Jerusalem. Because, I mean, I often feel a bit sorry for them because they race all the way back from Emmaus and they go, the Lord has risen, and everybody there goes, yes, we know, the women have seen him. And actually, Peter, he's had a chat with Peter already. You wouldn't believe it, would you? And you go, oh, okay, way to steal me thunder, guys. But what I love is that they get back and there's no, where have you been? Why did you abandon us? Why did you leave? Yeah. We stayed faithful. There's none of that. There's not even an implication of that in the way the story impacts and how they are drawn back into the community. There's a message there for the way that we as church function, isn't there?
Oh, completely. I think that's so true. And of course, I think it reflects maybe a humility in the group that they were all struggling. They were all struggling to believe. Many of them had sort of listened to the words of the women and thought their words were like nonsense to them, idle chat, as it were. The women amazed us, the two say, but you could literally translate that we thought the women were out of their minds. It's that sort of conversation. So I think you've got a humility in the community because none of them were like, quick off the blocks on this one. Every single one of them struggled to remember that Jesus said he would die and rise from the dead. And I love the fact that if you go to the very next verse at the end of the story, so when the two return and start to share verse 35, and it says this in verse 36, while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." And I love this. And even when Jesus walks into the room, he's not holding people to account. He's not chastising them at this stage. He is speaking peace to them. And he's seeking to bring this group together in the power of a revelation that will transform their lives forever. That Jesus hasn't just died, but Jesus has risen from the dead. And it is the power of his resurrection that becomes actually the completely unique element of this gospel proclamation and story. And so he speaks peace to them. And I love that.
Yeah.
Encouraging each other, blessing each other, helping each other, not judging one another because we stumble, but recognizing actually we all stumble, we all have weakness, we all have vulnerability, we've all doubted in our hearts. We've all had the moments where we've gone home, or at least wanted to go home to the wrong place. And yet we've also all experienced, I would suggest, the miraculous, gorgeous restoration, grace, mercy, and loving kindness of Jesus. And having had that extended to us, we should extend that to one another.
You're listening to UCB Life Issues. This week we are talking about the journey to Emmaus from Jerusalem post-resurrection, those two disciples who had their eyes open. Speaking with Dr. John Andrews, drjohnandrews.co.uk is his website, and you can get hold of a copy of Emmaus, the walk that changed everything, from his website. But the key is that element, isn't it, that they didn't see, and then the inviting of Jesus in, creating that context, the taking of the bread, the breaking it, they had their eyes opened. And I wonder if we could kind of draw things, and we have glossed incredibly over the surface of so much that is in your book. But I wonder if we could just focus on that for a minute, because I wonder for you in writing this, drawing this together, reflecting on this story, what is the power of us actually seeing Jesus? What is it, John 12, so we would see Jesus, that image, that thought that is made real, made manifest, made physical in the experience of these two disciples.
I love how Paul puts it when he writes to the church at Ephesus. He says, "I pray that you will have the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you will know him better." He goes on to almost double emphasis that. He says, "I pray that the eyes of your heart will be enlightened so that you will know the hope to which you've been called." And I love what Paul's doing there. He's linking the idea of knowing something transformational through a revelation that we see. And so this wisdom, this revelation, so that we will know him better, and then the eyes of our hearts enlightened so that we will know the hope to which we've been called. And ultimately, I think this is such an important part of the story, and also an important part of the biblical narrative, because when our hearts are truly open to see him, when we catch a glimpse of him by faith, when we catch a glimpse of him through his word, when you as an individual have an encounter with the resurrected Jesus, the reason that's so important is because we can't see that and then not do anything about that. We can't see that and ignore it. We can't see it and unsee it. It forces us to make a decision. Paul, on the road to Damascus, known as Saul then, has an encounter with Jesus where he sees the resurrected Jesus. And ironically, the seeing of that literally physically blinds him. But when Paul responds to Jesus, he sort of says to the Lord, "Lord, what do you want? Who are you, Lord?" And Jesus says to him, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting." And it was that revelation of Jesus, it was encounter with him, that revolutionized Paul. And ultimately, the message of the resurrection is one of encounter with him, encounter with Jesus. And that's what makes this so important. The resurrection means that you and I, by the Spirit of God, can encounter one who was dead but is now alive. And it's that encounter that is truly the thing that transforms us and changes us and causes us to move in a completely different direction than before. I was an 8-year-old boy when I got a revelation, Paul, that Jesus was the Son of God. And I'm now 58. So 50 years ago this month, I encountered the resurrection Jesus. And I've had ups and downs, ins and outs, good days, bad days, and ugly days, but I've never been able to unsee what I saw and unknow what I now know. And I've never been able to loose myself from that revelation. I may have had a struggle with the church. I may have had struggle with people. I may have even had a struggle with myself, but I've never been able to loose myself from what I saw. And those two disciples who met Jesus that day would never, ever, ever, ever be able to move away from that moment. It was a life-marking, life-changing moment. And that's why it's important for me and you today.
So what does that journey, that invitation into that house, that opening of the eyes, that racing back to Jerusalem, going from where felt like the safe place back to the place where they actually were supposed to be. What does that whole journey say to me today in a life where I am desperate to find more of that encounter with Jesus?
I think it speaks to us that if this story is saying anything, this story is saying that actually the experience of the two is often our experience, but also the Savior who drew alongside the two is the same Savior today, wanting to engage with men and women personally, privately, intimately, and dynamically. That although I believe in the beautiful corporateness of the Church of Jesus Christ, the Ecclesia, I am a passionate believer in the MO of a God who loves to step into the world of individuals where they are. And I think what Emmaus teaches us, Jesus didn't start where he was. Jesus started where they were. And Jesus, in walking with them, walked with them so that actually their hearts would ignite and create an opportunity of invitation. And I think if there are three elements on this road that speak to us today, Paul, there are these, that there's the element of humility. God loves humility. He loves a heart that says, I need you. I think there's the element of honesty. You know, the two awkwardly tell the truth of what they believe, hope to believe, and can't believe. And Jesus doesn't walk away at that moment, but he responds to their honesty and starts from the position of honesty. And then thirdly, we see their hunger. Stay with us. Please stay with us. Come in. I think the Lord loves those three attitudes, Paul. Humility, I need you. Honesty, this is who I am before you. Hunger, my goodness, I want you. And I think the resurrection story of the two on the road to Emmaus echoes these great ideas. And it says to us that when we reach out to him, when we invite him in, the God of heaven, the risen, resurrected Savior of the world, Jesus Christ, will enter. Every single time in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is invited in anywhere he goes. And so the message of the resurrection says this: if you will invite him, he will come. And in fact, the chances are he's already there before you even realize you want to invite him in.
And in that moment, giving the opportunity, as you've said already, of transformation, but also that opportunity of redirection, because that which God had for them, that which Jesus had for them, that community that they were a part of, that he wanted them to work in and with, and who knows where the future took them, and who knows where what experiences the future brought them, but they were instilled as part of that family, part of that body, which was not just their true destiny, but also actually their true home.
Completely. And I love the thought that they were in the upper room when the Holy Spirit came. I love the thought that they shared stories with Thomas, who had to hang around for a week before he caught his glimpse of the resurrected Jesus. I love the thought that actually they never went back to Emmaus, but they went to the ends of the earth. They went to the far reaches of the planet. They went to the nooks and the crannies, to the highways and the byways, and they spent their life telling their world that they had met the resurrected Lord. They could never go back to Emmaus because Emmaus could never be the same again. They could visit there, but they could never live there because ultimately Jesus was directing them to something, to someone much, 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 much bigger than them. And this is ultimately the story of the resurrection. All that the resurrection is not just about transforming me where I am, but transforming even the context of my expectation and world. The Lord wants to show me there is something greater, bigger, more glorious beyond me. And the resurrection introduces me to a world that is bigger than John Andrews, bigger than my postcode, bigger than Emmaus, bigger than where I live. And it's introducing me into a world that actually says, John, if you will follow me, if you will not only love me and serve me, but give yourself to the world that I'm calling you to, then actually this incredible journey becomes something of purpose and destiny and not simply something of personal transformation and change.
They were not the inner circle. They were not high-profile disciples. They weren't main characters in the story. In fact, we probably could describe them as part of the chorus, maybe even extras standing to the side of the stage. And you may think that you are not important enough for Jesus to bother with either. And yet the Bible is full of stories like the Emmaus Road, where God comes to the chorus, to the bit players, to the extras, to the people like you and me, and changes everything, brings his truth, reveals the reality of him, and transforms their destiny. He did it then on the road to Emmaus, and he still does it today. If we will have that hunger, that honesty, and that humility to allow him to come in. John's book is called Emmaus, The Walk That Changed Everything. You can find it through his website, drjohnandrews.co.uk. John, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to join us again today. Thank you very much.
It has been my absolute pleasure. God bless you all, and thank you once again. Thank you.
And thank you as well to Rebecca, my producer, for this week's Life Issues. Hey, why not join us next week for another one? Ta-da.